Alright students, welcome back to Medieval 1450. I hope you are all doing well. So today we're going to dive into the poem of the Cid. However, I strongly suggest that you read the poem of the Cid before you watch this, mainly because a lot of what we're going to talk about probably won't make a whole lot of sense if you don't have at least a basis for the plot. But that's ultimately up to you. I'm not your babysitter, so you can decide that for yourself ultimately. So, today, we will have a lecture to go along with your reading of the poem of the Cid and the study guide I have sent out. I will try to talk about some of the major themes of the text, some of which you may end up writing about for your essay that is going to be due this Sunday. So, to begin with, let's have a quick reminder of the historical El Cid and his context. El Cid, and the El is the Spanish article for the. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar is his full name, and variants are often used throughout the text. So anyway, El Cid was a member born into the low nobility, the son of a peasant and an aristocrat. As such, he was something of a quote-unquote self-made man, rising from the lower rungs on the social order, in order to virtually raise to the very highest level. Originally a vassal of Sancho, that is Alfonso VI's brother, he continued to serve Alfonso after Sancho died. El Cid seems to have been one of the many highly suspicious that Alfonso was responsible for his brother's death. This may have been a cause of his banishment, and also why Alfonso does not receive the most positive treatment in the text. He was banished twice in his life. During his first banishment, he served often as a mercenary, earning the title El Cid during his time in service to Muslims. It was after his second banishment, which the text seems to be based on, that he carved out his own kingdom of Valencia, remaining only nominally subject to Alfonso VI. Right, so then let's dive into the story itself. And again, while I go through the themes as they come up, I will jump around the text while discussing it, so once again, I highly recommend reading before watching this. So, we begin in medias res, with El Cid having already been banished and preparing to leave his home. We get this image of him in tears as he leaves a cleared-out home. Now, who did we see crying back in the Song of Roland? Quite frequently, in fact. Now, if you are thinking Charlemagne, you are spot on. In keeping with that description from Einhard, Charlemagne is almost too emotional, losing his self-control at the death of Roland. El Cid is also losing control, although we are left to figure out whether this is at, his having to leave home, or the injustice of his banishment despite his actual true loyalty. The story starts by demonstrating the depth of his emotion. But in the following lesson, how does he present himself? So, in the next lesson, we now see him supporting Minaya, his closest companion, and encouraging him. This is a far cry from the El Cid we just saw crying. But now he is no longer in private, while his tears express something positive to the audience and to his companions who need hope and to feel better as they are all cast out of their homes as well along with him. El Cid suppresses his own emotions to show them what they need. Now, we are ready to move on to the true beginning of their banishment. When El Cid goes to Burgos, he finds all the doors are barred to him. Why won't people help him? So after El Cid speaks with one person, he realizes that the people of Burgos have been ordered not to give him aid. Here we start to see what banishment really means. Yes, in Les 18, we realize that he has 6 days to leave before the banishment is enforced, but the threat of violence against a banished person is not the real problem. El Cid is not just kicked out of house and home, but cut off from society as a whole. Try to imagine, and I mean really imagine, what that means. El Cid has been turned into a refugee, albeit a fairly well-known, fairly wealthy, and fairly popular one. He cannot so much as seek food. Here, a gentleman by the name of Martin Antolínez steps in, providing for El Cid. He accepts that this means he, too, is also banished. This is a powerful statement in El Cid's favor for someone to accept banishment in his defense, and El Cid clearly recognizes the debt he owes as a result. Of course, banishment is an ancient tradition, that is Romans, Vikings, as we've seen in Hrothgar Saga, and more banished people. It even has a biblical resonance, with Adam and Eve banished from the Garden of Eden in Genesis. Banishment has another meaning for El Cid, and that is that he, a loyal vassal, is cut off from his place in feudal hierarchy. How can he serve as king when the king himself does not want his vassal? And so, in Les 4, we see a comment that tells us who this king is. The people of Burgos say, as one, what a good vassal, if only he had a good lord. Doesn't really speak well of you when your subjects find your vassal more worthy than you, but there is plenty to prove that their opinions are justified. Despite being exiled, El Cid behaves like a vassal, attacking Alfonso's enemies, that is to say Muslims in this case, and not speaking ill of his king. But even after, he goes one step further, as we see for the first time in Les 47 and 48. What does he do? So not only is El Cid victorious in battle and seems loyal to Alfonso, but he takes a portion of the spoils and returns them to Alfonso as well, behaving in this exactly like a vassal should be doing. Despite Alfonso's banishment, he continues to behave like a vassal. This is not just a show or going through the motions, as every action seems primed to return him to his lord's side. Of course, there's the question of whether Alfonso is a worthy lord. In Les 99, just before El Cid's banishment is lifted, what happens to him and the king? Well, we get this brief comical scene of the king coming upon El Cid's forces, whereupon a panic ensues. He and his men are frightened because they think El Cid might be an enemy. Alfonso lacks this quality of El Cid to look unshaken before his men and to recognize an ally when he sees one. And then there's this guy, Ordóñez, who seems to set out to undermine Alfonso's and El Cid's relationship. A bad advisor if there ever was one. There's also the king's unwise support of the Infantes of Carrion. What kind of king makes bad matches for his vassals and endangers their families? El Cid needs to ensure the king takes responsibility for the match by making him hand off his daughters. Now, let's consider El Cid as a Christian. From the first Les, we see El Cid is looking to God for support. His piety is clear and consistently expressed. When he is about to leave in Les 12, we see him give his last words towards God and the local church, asking for aid in his journey. Following that, he visits the monastery to which he has entrusted his wife and daughters. Entrusting his family to God's hands again returns to this image of a pious servant of God. He also supports this monastery, sending them money from his conquest, which also serves to resolve the potential issues of a warrior hoping to be saved if he gives money to God. He is running that fine line we discussed on Courtly Love Day between a man of peace and a man of war. This is put on display perhaps the best around Les 59. After another battle, El Cid is confronted with Count Ramon, who refuses to eat or drink. Ramon is acting out the honor and pride we've seen before, while we learn that El Cid only wishes to offer mercy and compassion to a defeated enemy. Ultimately, Ramon accepts, demonstrating not only the depth but also the strength of El Cid's Christian traits to move such a man. But notice one other thing going on here. What does El Cid offer Ramon in particular? Bread and wine. Now, why is that significant? Now, if you recall any Christian practices, El Cid is offering the foodstuffs of communion to Ramon, ministering to him for physical well-being as a priest would minister the congregation for its spiritual well-being. Now let's move from here into some less uplifting aspects of El Cid. Beginning in Les 7, a rather sordid series of events occurs. What does El Cid order Antolínez to prepare? He orders him to set up 2 magnificently decorated chests full of sand, right? And then what? They will be taken to these 2 people, Raquel and Vidas, and pawned off as though they were wealth he cannot bring with him on campaign. So El Cid is tricking these 2 by offering a sham as collateral. But who are these 2 people? Who are Raquel and Vidas? Well, their profession is as a pawnbroker, a form of money lending, and they emphasize that they need to be making a profit. Now, we've talked a bit about how such professions were popular among those not permitted to own land, and with their names being ones commonly found among the medieval Jewish community, we can be fairly certain Raquel and Vidas are meant to be seen as Jews. This is a prime example of what is called coding. By choosing specific aspects of individuals to emphasize, people's identity can be revealed without ever outright stating it. This can be used to literary effect, but it is a dangerous way of playing with stereotypes. But let's look at what the scene shows. Is El Cid depicting as doing something bad here? I think it's clear that he is depicted as being clever, tricking these people to gain money he needs on campaign. Perhaps we are meant to see this as humorous, the clever hero deceiving the greedy pawnbrokers. But this is only funny if we ignore the valence of these comments or view his deception of Jews as acceptable precisely because they are Jewish. Though interestingly, and quite on the other hand, El Cid's depiction of Muslims is much more respectable. First of all, do we get any old conceptions of Muslim beliefs like that of the Song of Roland in this story? Hopefully you answered no to that question, because this time the author seems familiar enough with Islam to give us Muslims who don't explicitly violate the basic tenets of the faith, like worship one God and Muhammad is not a god. So, we have to give this at least that. But we also have much more done to humanize Muslims. When El Cid takes Castellón, he realizes he must rapidly move on, lest he find himself in the way of Alfonso and be killed. El Cid recognizes the danger from a Christian is greater than the Muslims, and indeed he frees many Muslim prisoners. El Cid recognizes that taking the fortress is the goal, and that now that peace has been earned, he can trust Muslims not to betray him, although it is not clear that keeping their word is in their best interests. This is a far cry from the Song of Roland, where the Muslims, of course, plot to betray their treaties. But the Muslims supporting him seems to be more than a political move. El Cid leaves with the blessings of the Moorish men and women, even. But El Cid's ability to work with Muslims is not simply the ability to have them as loyal subjects. We must also meet one of his closest allies and closest companions in Les 84. Aben Galban is a man El Cid trusts in missions, sends out with the Infantes and his daughters, and is a Muslim. He is not treated poorly for this fact, and is one of an otherwise fairly small cast of named friends of El Cid. While the Song of Roland suggests that Muslims like Balagant could be good nobles if they were Christian, El Cid seems to not need that qualification. This is not to say, of course, that all people can be good neighbors. Yusuf, here called the King of Morocco, is the historically attested Almoravid ruler who El Cid and Alfonso did, in fact, clash with. How does he respond to El Cid's conquests? Not only is he angry about them, but he is very clear that religion is at the heart of it in a way we do not see from most people in the poem of the Cid. But this is in keeping with the more fundamentalist Almoravids. We also see how living in Al-Andalus is shaping both Christian and Muslims. Despite their conflicts, Aben-Galban, El Cid, and others treat each other with the same level of tolerance. But Yusuf comes from outside and does not share this respect for the Christian neighbors he has not had back in Morocco. But his attitude is also reflected by those who have no such excuse, such as the Infantes of Carrion. They plot to murder Aben-Galban, one of the many scenes that demonstrates how they are found wanting in their personalities. But this more complex role of faith that does not allow for simple categorization of morality calls for other ways to determine nobility. So, let's unpack the idea of nobility and the nobleman versus the noble man. The Infantes, the two men El Cid's daughters are married to, are nobility. We hear them talk about this in Les 82 when they are considered a marriage into his family, when they first consider a marriage into his family. At the time, they reject it after mentioning how El Cid may have impressive deeds under his belt, but is of much lower birth. They are noblemen, that is, the one-word form, born into honor rather than earning it themselves. Consequently, they react with anger to the disdain and mocking they receive. Take a look at the very start of the third cantar for perhaps the best example of this. We have this scene where a lion breaks free, and El Cid's companions protect him. El Cid calms the lion, and the Infantes embarrass themselves by hiding. But despite El Cid's request they not be mocked, they blame him for their shame, not themselves. They surrender their swords, ultimately taking away their best defense before the combat. In the end, do the Infantes have honor of their own, or an inherited sham? El Cid, however, is a self-made man. All his honor is something he takes for himself. He has won battles, captured land, taken loot, and risen from banishment to honor over the course of the text. When it is challenged by the Infantes, he has to maintain his honor by seeking redress. Perhaps El Cid represents a pure form of honor, one he has fashioned for himself. Oh, and he has also grown a fantastic beard, and like in the Song of Roland, beards are quite the marker of masculinity. As we wrap up, let's consider the roles this text performs. Written in Spain in the 12th century, it is a text intrinsically linked to a context where the Christian Spanish kingdoms were pushing into Muslim kingdoms. Here, he can play several crucial roles. First, he is a model to follow as Christians are fighting the Almohads later in the century, a banner to rally behind, much as Charlemagne resonates in much of Europe. He thus also serves as a more localized national hero for the growing sense of what it means to be Spanish, although this identity is still split across the various Christian kingdoms. He serves as an aspirational figure, an individual others would and should seek to live up to. He also got one final role. Now that the Infantes are disgraced, who can his daughters marry? They become the queens of Navarre and Aragon, marrying to an even higher station than before. But this means that, as the final line suggests, El Cid's bloodline is continued through the royal houses of Spain, which have thus, at least in theory, inherited his virtues and mission of protecting a Christian image of Spain. Interestingly, El Cid in reality had a son. This may be one of the reasons for his erasures from the text, emphasizing this royal nature of El Cid's descendants. Well, that will be the last of the big texts we read for the semester. Your essay either on this or on the Song of Roland will be due this Sunday, but in the meantime, we'll move on to some other aspects of life in High Medieval Europe.